Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Simon Pearce, and I am a genealogist for Ancestry ProGenealogists. And I just want to say a big good morning and good afternoon to everyone across Canada who is joining me this afternoon and this morning for this video. It's a real pleasure and an honour for me to be talking to you today on a 130-year anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. It really is a momentous and important part of First World War history and Canadian history. And like I said, it's a real honour for me to be talking about it with you today. The aim of today really is for me to give you a little bit of an introduction about myself, maybe a day in the life of a genealogist at Ancestry, the kind of work that I do. And I'm going to talk a bit about Vimy Ridge and its importance, and really focus in on First World War military research from a Canadian perspective, because I've had the pleasure and the privilege of researching Canadian men and women in the First World War for many years now. And I picked up a few tips that I'd like to share with you that might help you, and we'll answer a few questions at the end, and have a few projects and a few things I'd like to share with you. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm a genealogist for Ancestry ProGenealogists. I'm based in our London office, and I do have my dream job. I get to help clients day in, day out, discover where they came from, their family history, break down brick walls. Sometimes it can be just starting with one particular line and researching that as far as I can. Other times it can be honing in on a very specific ancestor and researching them. It's quite varied. I mainly specialize in military research. And before I joined Ancestry, I worked for the National Army Museum in London, researching men and women from the First and Second World Wars. And although I predominantly carry out British research and military research, my job does take me all over the world, really, in terms of the records I look at. My team specializes also in the British Empire and the Dominions. So I'll end up researching in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And I'm sure many of you at home can relate to this, that genealogy can take you all over the world. It's so exciting when you get to research collections from, the other side of the world that, it can really take you by surprise and open your eyes up to new research. So that's a real special part of my job. But I do get to work predominantly on military research and on some quite exciting projects. And one in particular related to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is really the center point of today's talk and what I really want to delve into a little bit deeper. We teamed up with Canadian social media influencer Dan Rodo. You may have heard of him or seen some of his work before. And we did a little bit of research for Dan because his great-grandfather actually served with the Canadian Army during the First World War. And we took Dan to France, to Vimy Ridge, and we revealed his story to him. Dan didn't know anything about his ancestors' background, a great deal about his service, and it was a real exciting moment to actually stand there in front of the memorial and tell him that his great-grandfather had served at Vimy Ridge. Now, some of you may be familiar with the battle. Whenever I speak to my Canadian friends or colleagues, they always seem to know about Vimy Ridge, and it emphasises to me just how important it must be to a Canadian, in not only from a military perspective, but in the history of your country as well. If you're not so familiar with it, well, today is the 103rd year anniversary, the 9th of April 1917. Almost 100,000 Canadians, the first time that all 4 Canadian divisions had fought together, launched an attack on Vimy Ridge. And it was a great success. It did come at a cost, but it was an amazing success. And a lot of that owed to the planning and the preparation and the training that was involved. I mean, a lot of lessons have been learned from the disasters of the Somme the year before, and the Canadians were praised for their preparation, the way they used artillery, their training in German weapons, the way they handed maps out to their own men. It was really thorough. And it was an incredible achievement, and they almost took all of their objectives and most of the ridge in the first day of the attack on the 9th of April. And it's so important because it really signaled to the Allies and to the Germans that the Canadians had arrived. it showed what they could do, and it really set the benchmark for the rest of the war. The Canadians had many more successes throughout the war and in the final stages of the war. And it was a really historic and momentous occasion, and something that you can be very proud of. So it was a real privilege to be standing outside Vimy Ridge with Dan and reveal this to him, and reveal that he had an ancestor that took part in this incredible event. And for me, I visited in 2003, 2002 with school, and I never thought that I would ever return again and have the opportunity to do what I did. And it was very, very special. And it was a beautiful, sunny, cold winter's morning when we were there, and the battlefields and the memorial looked absolutely incredible. And perhaps some of you listening at home have been before. I'd love to hear. Please share with the community if you have. It would be really interesting to hear if you've visited, or if you have ancestors that perhaps served there. And we touched on a number of really interesting military collections, a number of which are available on Ancestry and some externally, that I'll talk to you about today. I really hope that I can share some tips with you on researching your First World War ancestors. Perhaps it'll help you break down a brick wall, or you might be a little bit stuck with certain ancestors. So yeah, I'll reveal a few of those to you today. And I have a number of top tips to share with you as well. Because I said, although I specialize in British research, I've done a fair amount of Canadian in the past, a lot of projects. A lot of people from my hometown emigrated to Canada and settled there and served with the Canadian Army. And I even had the privilege of attending the Canadian armistice ceremony in 2012. And I still have my Canadian poppy that I proudly keep. And you can see it's very different from the British, the UK poppy that we have. And yeah, that's one of my kind of treasured little mementos there. So yeah, say you have an ancestor that served in the First World War, or even at Vimy Ridge, and you're a little bit stuck. Well, what records can you look at? Well, I have a number of top tips. Now, I think first and foremost, it's always important that you try and find a service record. Service records are an incredible source for researching an ancestor. It will give you when the individual enlisted, when they were discharged, where they served, a little bit about their background. I mean, military records are absolutely fantastic for not only military information, but genealogical information as well. And we have a really useful collection on Ancestry called the Canadian World War I CEF personnel files. And if you're interested in any of the collections I'm talking about today, we've posted a blog in the copy of this video where you can follow some of the links and have a look afterwards, or follow along with me while I'm talking. So yeah, the Canadian World War I CEF personnel files, they're where you'll find your ancestors' service record. And have a look. Sometimes they can be really substantial. Often I find they're actually more in depth than some of the British records I look at for British soldiers. The level of detail is incredible, and it really helps you to piece together your ancestors' service and really kind of get your head around where they were stationed, what theatres of war they saw action in, even things down to where they were on leave. And you'll often see medical reports, even dental reports in there. It's very varied. So have a look through the personnel files first and foremost. Another tip I would say is, once you have the personnel file, where do you go from there? Well, one of the things we always want to establish is, what was my ancestor experiencing? What were they doing? You know, what kind of battles were they taking part in? Where were they stationed? And I would advise that you have a look at a war diary. And some of you may have used these in the past. They're an incredible source. They're held by Library and Archives Canada, which I'm sure many of you may be familiar with. Their online catalogue has a number of digitized war diaries. And if you know units, so for example, when we researched Dan's great-grandfather, he served with the 38th Canadian Infantry Battalion. So we looked for the diary, and we wanted to really hone in and study the battalions and the units' action around Vimy Ridge. And it really will provide you an amazing day-to-day account. So I would suggest looking on the Library and Archives Canada catalogue, or following the link that we've provided here, and you can have a look and see if you can find the war diary. Just to give you an example of the kind of content you can expect to see, I have an extract from the war diary of the 38th Battalion who took part in the Vimy Ridge attacks. And it's incredible, the level of detail, and it really puts you there. And it explains that at 5:30 a.m., the battalion jumped off and left the trenches. And you have a blow-by-blow account, and sometimes it can be incredibly detailed. Often at the end of a diary, there'll be appendices. So always check the end for any maps or lists of perhaps casualties or men commended for bravery. But even in this war diary, 25 minutes after the attack began, it says that Lieutenant Colonel C.M. Edwards reported that the battalion has taken all of its objectives and hadn't encountered very much shrapnel. So it's a really, really interesting insight, the war diaries, into what your ancestor was experiencing. So I definitely suggest looking at them. Another tip would be to remember that women played a hugely important role, not just from the Canadian Army, but in armies across the world during the First World War. I think that's really, really important to remember. And our Canadian personnel files collection also includes records for female ancestors, particularly those that carried out hugely important roles as nurses. So if you think you might have an ancestor who was a nurse, or a female ancestor that may have saw service during the First World War with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, I'd advise having a look in that collection and seeing what you can find, because again, it can be a really illuminating and really amazing record collection to study. So if you do have a female ancestor, definitely have a look in that collection. Some people, when I'm advising on First World War research, tell me that they cannot find an ancestor that served in the war. They might think, okay, my grandfather or great grandfather, he was of military age, but I just can't find him in any records. And it is the case that although so many men and women from served and did their bit during the war, sometimes you just don't have any luck, and you can't find them in the records, or perhaps your ancestor was on reserved occupation. So I often say to people that, look, just remember, maybe think laterally. Do you have any ancestors? Perhaps it's the brothers or sisters, the siblings of your grandfather or great grandfather. Perhaps anyone that's born between the 1870s and 1900. Have a look for them as well, and see if you can find them in the records. Because sometimes you have to think a little bit more laterally to find an ancestor that served. Another thing to remember is that, of course, not everyone served with the army. You may have an ancestor that served in the Canadian Navy, and those records are held by Library and Archives Canada as well. They have a really good online guide for researching your Canadian naval ancestors, so have a look there. And perhaps you had an ancestor that served with the Air Force. Now, the Canadian Air Force wasn't established until 1926, but if you do have a Canadian ancestor that you think served with the Air Force, their records are most likely in the British collection, because they would have joined the British Royal Flying Corps and later the RAF. So you can have a look for that. That will be under the British First World War personnel service records. Another tip I would give you is to always look for photos. Now, it may seem like a bit of sort of a left field suggestion, but when we were doing this research for the Vimy Ridge project, we really wanted to look at some photographs of the terrain, of the local area, of some of the trenches, to really kind of give us an idea of, really build up a picture, literally, of what we were researching. And again, Library and Archives Canada has a fantastic array of digitized photographs from the war. And it can, you might not necessarily find your ancestor in this collection, but you might find a picture of the battalion, of a company. You may see them serving overseas. Perhaps they served on the Western Front or in Gallipoli. I was trying to look at photographs as well in that collection, because that's a really useful way of just building up a better picture of your ancestors' service. Those are some of my key tips, but there's a number of other records as well that I would suggest using. Maps, for example. Now, maps, when you're doing research, is absolutely vital, particularly from a military point of view. These were absolutely crucial in our Vimy Ridge project with Dan. We wanted to look at where his grandfather's or his great-grandfather's unit was stationed, the trenches they were in, where they were attacking, where they were been stationed afterwards. And you'll notice that in the war diaries, you'll often see grid references that can be used on trench maps. And we've left a link in the blog for you to the trench maps that are held by McMaster University. Some of you may have heard of them before. They have an amazing collection of First World War trench maps. Have a little go at playing around with that collection. See if you can find any trench maps for Vimy Ridge. See if you can find any that relate to the locations that your ancestors served in. One tip is to remember that the Allied trenches will be in blue lines and the German trenches in red. But they're a really amazing source at helping to plot the movements of your ancestor. And sometimes I think it's a little bit of an overlooked aspect of research. But maps, not just for military research, but in wider genealogical research, are a really, really amazing tool. So have a look and see if you have any luck using that collection. Another record set that I like using for Canadian research is the Imperial War Service's gratuities collection. It covers 1919 to 1921, and it relates to any gratuities or money, essentially, that was paid to Canadian soldiers when they returned home. Now, it might not give you a huge amount more information than that you'll find in a service record, but it's quite a nice collection in terms of the level of documentation and correspondence that relating to your ancestor that was kept even up to the 50s and 60s. I've looked through many of these before, and sometimes you see typed or handwritten letters, but it's really, really useful from a genealogical perspective because you'll often see addresses or next of kin mentioned in this collection, and particularly as you go into the 20th century, into the mid 20th century, it's a really, really useful collection for plotting your ancestors' movements. So have a look at the Imperial War Service's gratuity collection. That's a really, really good one to take a look at and see if you can find your ancestor in there. My next record collection I want to talk about is quite an interesting one, and we have similar collections in the UK, but you have a really good collection called the Canada Military Honours and Award Citation Cards, and these are on Ancestry, and they actually cover the period of 1900 to 1961. But they're really, really useful from a First World War perspective. They note citations, so a small biography, if you like, or a write-up, anytime someone was awarded for gallantry. And with the example we've used is from a soldier called Nicholson, and he was awarded the military medal for bravery at Vimy Ridge. And this is really a really amazing addition to a really amazing collection, really, because military medal citations for British soldiers don't necessarily exist. So it's amazing from a Canadian perspective that you have military medal citations for Canadian soldiers. And this particular record from the collection mentions, and I'll read the extract as follows: for conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty during the attack on Vimy Ridge on the 9th of April 1917. He set a magnificent example of courage and coolness,